While spending only 3 days in Rome, I always find I'm quite relieved to reach Florence. Though a small city in its own right, downtown Florence is a perfect scale for having so much available to see and learn from, and yet small enough to get around on foot and feel that you can settle into a city that is human-sized. Like Pisa, at the center of Florence we have a cathedral, Campanile or tower, and Baptistry. While Florence was in an artistic arms race with the surrounding cities, they knew that a massive cathedral would cement their position as the leading city in the region. The Medici family's banking business and the wool guild trade had been so successful that the Florentine florin had become the international currency of the Renaissance. Given the confidence of the city fathers, they began a structure of such size that they really did not know how to complete the massive dome that was needed to cover the center of the building. After completing the lower section, it was the courageous artist and engineer Brunelleschi who proposed the final design for the dome, or as the Italians like to say, il Duomo. There is a lovely National Geographic article on the story you can find at the link in the notes below. The facade or front of the cathedral is quite lovely, but it was not completed until the 19th century. Many Florentines consider it to be overly ornate, but the marble is quite pleasing. The interior of the cathedral is surprisingly plain. Despite having exiled him for a period, Florence is the city of Dante, and there's a lovely illustrative painting of him and the themes covered in the Divine Comedy found on the walls here. As always, take time to observe the humble servants below your feet, pointing you always towards the beauty of marble and geometric design. A climb to the top of the Duomo or the Campanile will be well rewarded with many fine views of the surrounding buildings and countryside. Across from the cathedral and Campanile stands the Baptistry. Children were not allowed into the cathedral until they were baptized, as they were not considered Christians until receiving baptism. Dante himself received baptism here. The baptistry was built between 1059 and 1128, but stands in remarkably good condition. The exterior is a very good example of Romanesque architecture, but its doors and interior ceiling are what draws the most visitors. The set of doors on the east side was created by Lorenzo Ghiberti, and because of their ornate depictions of biblical events, Michelangelo called them the Gates of Paradise. The south doors were created by Andrea Pisano. While they are not as ornate as those of Ghiberti, they combine the Christian and pagan virtues that Dante uses to divide the various levels of purgatory: fortitude, temperance, justice, and prudence, and then from the Christians, faith, hope, and love, or charity. The interior ceiling provides a wonderful challenge as you will attempt to identify all the biblical stories depicted. Christ presides over all as king. You'll also notice the depiction of Satan is very similar to that given by Dante. Dante describes Satan as sitting at the bottom of hell, devouring the worst of sinners. The image of Satan devouring sinners is also used in the ceiling of the cathedral itself. Florence is full of lovely churches. Another favorite is Santa Croce. Here we find the grave of another of Florence's favorite sons, Niccolò Machiavelli, author of The Prince. Although his political thought is widely criticized for being too pessimistic, he had a profound influence on many Italian princes and political thinkers throughout Western history. Now we need to transition from art to church history and theology. Our next stop is the Monastery of San Marco, where the monk Savonarola preached and lived. However, before we understand Savonarola, we need to go back even further to the Council of Florence in 1439. And this council cannot be understood without reference to the Emperor Constantine and the fact that he moved the capital of the Roman Empire to Constantinople in 330 AD. So let's rewind for a little bit. By effectively creating two capitals to the empire, Constantine established two cities that would compete for preeminence among the various churches. The power contest eventually led to the Great Schism of the Orthodox and Roman Catholics in 1054. The Pope of Rome and the Patriarch of Constantinople reciprocally excommunicated one another and lived in mutual antagonism, forcing churches to be divided in allegiance to the East or West. However, after the Great Schism, Rome, who had been the poorer half of the empire, rose in power, and the wealthy East faced one setback after another as the Muslim armies continued to slice off portion after portion of the empire. When the Patriarch of Constantinople was almost completely surrounded, he made an attempt at reconciliation with Rome in order to forge a military alliance with the now mighty West. He hoped that this alliance might save him from the hordes of Ottoman Muslims beating down his empire. The Eastern Emperor and Patriarch came to Florence in 1439, and a council was held to work out a compromise. After heated debate, the two actually agreed to reunify the Church, being willing to come over to most of the Roman Catholics' doctrines on the points where they had differed. However, most of the Eastern bishops back home would not accept the agreement, and in 1453, Constantinople finally fell to the Ottomans, and the Greek cathedral of Constantinople, Hagia Sophia, was converted into a mosque. During the time of the Council of Florence, the Greek scholar Platon gave lectures on the philosophy of Plato to the intellectuals of Florence. These lectures inspired Cosimo de' Medici to found a new academy of philosophy in Florence that would contribute substantially to the revival of classical learning during the Renaissance. The Medici family became quite interested in a revival of art and classical learning. They were quite impressed by the beauty of the ancient world, but this brings us back to the monk Savonarola. Despite the Medici's love of classical learning, he became very suspicious that all this pagan culture was moving the Florentines away from Christian righteousness. It was here at San Marco that Savonarola lived and began his preaching ministry. Savonarola was a very popular preacher in Florence, and he began to preach against the growing luxuriance and immorality of the city fathers and merchants of Florence, and particularly the luxuriant Medicis. Gradually, he gained the backing of the people of Florence, and for a period, he even established a theocracy in Florence that attempted to reassert biblical law. Savonarola's popularity was short-lived, however, and the wealthy Medici family was able to regain power and eventually even arrest and execute Savonarola in the Piazza della Signoria. Though Savonarola's political power was at an end, many of the criticisms he had for the Florentines and their love of worldly beauty would be echoed by Martin Luther and the Protestants. Luther read Savonarola with approval and felt his thoughts sparked the later Reformation. Walking the streets of Florence is itself a delight. Much of the city center is reserved for pedestrian traffic, and the many small alleyways and wonderful collection of historic buildings creates a nearly limitless space for your exploration and interest. The Loggia de Lanzi on the Piazza della Signoria, built in 1376, is quite worth your examination. Many statues are housed here, the most famous being that of Perseus holding the head of Medusa, but also lovers of Homer will find the statue of Menelaus and Patroclus interesting. Look up over the arches for the 4 pagan virtues mentioned by Dante: fortitude, temperance, justice, and prudence.